Hello, everyone, and welcome to another mini episode of Balckwell's Books, the audio program in which I talk about books. Me or I being Balckwell. Today, we are covering Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, first published in 1932. This is an immensely popular novel in the English-speaking world. Many people read it in high school or hear about it in high school. It's brought up all the time, as far as I see, by people because, this sort of dystopian fiction is quite popular nowadays, and Brave New World specifically accurately sees, or accurately Aldous Huxley seems to understand certain trends that were occurring in the 20th century, and the book is an attempt to reckon with where these trends might lead us in the future. Obviously, Aldous Huxley's idea here is not to predict the future. That's not what sort of science fiction or even dystopian fiction is about. It's about showing showing the possible endpoints of certain trends, and in many respects, Brave New World is a satire. And I think this might sometimes be ignored or not accentuated to the point that I think it should, because it's quite clear, especially at the beginning of the book. He definitely had that sort of almost Jonathan Swift sort of style here. I mean, when Jonathan Swift writes about proposing we should all eat babies, clearly he doesn't actually mean that. It's an exaggeration. And this book is very clearly an exaggeration in its initial sections. Later, the book attempts to ground itself a little more, but especially this first chapter, when we're dealing with when we're presented with this sort of eugenics facility in England. All these references to his Ford ship, the crosses with their tops lopped off to become T's, it's ridiculous. It's overdone. It's crazy. This idea that Henry Ford and this mass production model would take over as a sort of civil religion of England. And this whole passage is sort of littered with these little jokes, little jabs that make it clear the sort of mode that Aldous Huxley is working in here. It is deliberately ridiculous. It's supposed to shock us. It's supposed to make us think this is crazy. And there's actually quite a good reason for this. Because the world that exists in Brave New World is crazy. But all the people living in it, or I should say most of the people living in it that we see, don't find it crazy. They think it's totally normal and totally fine. And this isn't because they're stupid necessarily, although some of them are presented as quite explicitly kind of stupid. It is because this world is taking their desires into account. That this world doesn't feel, it's not like something like 1984 where a world is imposed on people. In Brave New World, it's very easy to see how actual human desires of a massive populace of people could lead to such a world, that their desires are being fulfilled, and many of them could quite easily be said to be happy. These nobody or most of the characters are not disappointed in this world, and so while we read it often as a dystopia, it's utopian. And in fact, I think in a way, it's almost satirizing utopia, utopianism in itself. That when you try to create a world that fulfills people's desires so succinctly and so impersonally, this is sort of what you get. You get these sort of this impersonal world, this world where everything's taken care of for you, where you're not inspired to create anything. There's none of the suffering that inspires people to true sort of creativity. And I think a lot of what's missing in Brave New World that would make us think of it as a dystopia is this lack of human individuality, human freedom, creative freedom, the arts in general. I mean, we see later on in the book that most of the people who dissent are artists. So anyway, that's the people who like it. But what's funny in this book is that the people who don't like the sort of regime or the brave new world in which they live are extremely broken and sort of antisocial individuals. They're not heroes, and while they're relatable, we don't relate to them for their positive qualities. But if we do relate to them, it's in their negative qualities. It's in these in the neuroses, and they're pretty unlikable, to be honest. And it's quite an interesting idea here, because if we see this book as a dystopia, or we think Aldous Huxley is presenting a dystopia, it is an odd choice then to make the dissenters such sort of terrible people that we don't like. Clearly, it's not as simple as this book depicting a dystopia. Clearly, Aldous Huxley has some sort of sympathy with the authorities that maintain this world. Clearly, he sees that this world is providing something for people. It has some positive qualities, or else it makes no sense to have the characters like this. It's clearly intentional. And so these two characters we have, the first is Bertrand Marx. This is future Balckwell here. I kept calling him Bertrand Marx. That's just a mistake. His name is Bernard Marx, but I'm not going to go edit every time I say Bertrand. It's Bernard, I say Bertrand. That's just the way it is. So this is quite obviously a reference to Karl Marx. And the idea here is, so if we look at Brave New World as a satirization or criticism of utopian thinking, this is sort of playing off the idea of Karl Marx as a utopian thinker. I think this is kind of a misinterpretation on Huxley's part, but it was a very common interpretation at the time, especially if we look at the fact that he's living in a world where Karl Marx's ideology, or the ideology of Marxism, is being instrumentalized as a utopian vision in the Soviet Union. You can sort of understand this idea of Marx as a utopian thinker. Personally, I think there's Marx is a bit more grounded than that, and that obviously it's very materialist philosophy, very grounded in the present reality and criticizing the present reality. But there was this sort of right-wing idea that Karl Marx's criticisms were innately personal and were based on the fact that Karl Marx couldn't thrive in a capitalist system, that he was like lazy or all these other things. And this is the reason his sort of they think he developed a sort of resentment toward capitalism that caused him to write Capital and talk about communism. I think most people now look at that. Well, I mean, a lot of people still believe this, but it's not really accurate, I don't think. But this is sort of the idea that Aldous Huxley is using here. Bertrand Marx does not like this system because he doesn't fit in it. You know, he is sort of in the upper echelon of people in terms of this eugenically divided class structure, but he's short and he's kind of grumpy and dumpy, and people don't like him. The women don't really want to sleep with him, even though it seems everyone likes sleeping with everyone. He's sort of not part of that. He's an outcast. And we see that when Bertrand Marx finds his avenue for fitting in to the sort of social fabric, when he starts using John Savage and exhibiting him and getting this sort of praise and popularity that comes from being associated with John Savage, he's fine. He's like, yeah, this is cool. You know, as long as this world is serving me, it's good. When it's not serving me, it's bad. So it's kind of an interesting that someone who is critiquing the world, I mean, it's kind of a straw man when you think about it, but that the world is a dystopia when it's not good for him, but it's a utopia when it's good for him. This is sort of a part of Huxley's sort of criticism of utopia in general, I think, because a utopia is always going to be somewhat personal. When people write these stories of utopias, what they're writing is a world that would work really great for specifically the type of person that they are. And some people are able to sort of expand their mind and think of other people and try to be more altruistic in that sense. But most utopias are pretty focused on pleasing a certain type of person. And Brave New World does the same thing because, you know, obviously the people who benefit from Brave New World are the eugenically superior alphas, and everyone else is not having such a good time. Although, are they having a bad time? I mean, every time they're presented, they're sort of happy little sheep. So it's weird. Perhaps a part of this sort of altruism, I mean, in terms of a utopia created by the nobles or utopia created by the elites, is this fundamental misunderstanding of the proletariat or of the average, you know, working person, that they are kind of stupid, that they are almost beast-like or animal-like in their desires, that if you give them these simple things, like give them food, give them entertainment, then they will just go along with anything, that they don't have this sort of deeper or higher feelings, or you know, that come out in artwork or things like this. So that's another sort of implicit criticism there. So then we have John Savage, and I mean, talk about on the nose, but John Savage, he's a weird guy. The son of a woman who is from this sort of world that Bertrand Marx exists in, this sort of very regulated eugenic utopia. I'm using quotation marks when I say utopia. I guess you can't, people listening to this can't see that, but I hope it comes across in my voice, I suppose. So John Savage is born in this sort of reservation that has a lot of weird racial aspects to it that I don't really want to get into right now, because I don't have the time or the expertise to really get into it too much at the moment. But he's sort of an outcast in this world because his parents are both from the sort of so-called world state. He's not really accepted on this sort of cultural reserve that exists in New Mexico, I think it is. And so he's caught between these two worlds. And so he loses himself in literature, and specifically in Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is one of these guys. I mean, this is going to sound weird to say, but he's just one of these guys that these sort of mid-20th century people love to point to as like the epitome of culture. Like Shakespeare is like the highest form of poetics, or like his dramas are art. Like if you want to represent something being high art, you talk about Shakespeare. We see in Ray Bradbury in Fahrenheit 451, he talks about Shakespeare a lot in terms of the value of books or literature in that sense. And don't want to get into that because that book's a whole other world, whole other thing. Don't really like that one. But anyway, so John Savage loves Shakespeare, and he's sort of idealizes the past, idealizes the literature of Shakespeare, and is pretty disappointed in the world that actually exists. Bertrand Marx sort of takes him out of this reservation, brings him back to the sort of so-called world state, and John Savage does not like it, because people here also don't act like William Shakespeare's characters, and that's very disappointing to him, and they don't appreciate these sort of higher ideals, this high art that John Savage has come to understand. And he ends up sort of resigning himself to a sort of extreme asceticism. Because one thing that this world doesn't provide, the world state doesn't provide, is suffering. And John Savage believes that what leads to art, what leads to this sort of, high literature of Shakespeare is suffering. And so this is why at the end of the novel he turns to a sort of extreme asceticism. So when we read Brave New World, it ends up actually being somewhat difficult to understand in sort of black and white terms, whether this dystopia, or whether this place or this world that has been created is dystopian or utopian, who it's dystopian for and who it's utopian for. And like I said before, I think this is an implicit critique of utopian thinking in general. Because when we talk to the sort of one of the administrators of the whole system at the end of the book, you can tell that there is a lot of sympathy in the way that he's written for the way that this world is constructed. And that this sort of philosophy of people as sort of pleasure maximizing machines, that you can sort of make them happy by just pumping them full of pleasure, essentially, and that pleasure is the opposite of suffering and the opposite of pain, and that suffering and pain are contradictory to pleasure. This is the sort of philosophy that serves as the foundation for the world state that has been created. And we see in the novel that it is partially correct, that there is a sense in which this world does work for certain people. But you can also see in the examples of Bertrand Marx and John Savage that it's not working for everyone, that there's something missing, that there's something missing there, and that this something missing can only really be found on the fringes, because it's been pushed away. But it's difficult to say that John Savage's utopia wouldn't isolate even more people, or that Bertrand Marx's potential utopia wouldn't, in its own way, push people out and ignore large masses of people. Bertrand Marx's Utopia would work really well for Bertrand Marx, and if we think about it, very likely would not work very well for basically anyone who isn't Bertrand Marx. So I think that's really what I take away from Brave New World at the end, is that I don't see it. I mean, it does have these satirical qualities of criticizing, pleasure maximizing, criticizing eugenics, but not really criticizing eugenics in a particularly effective manner. I think if he's really trying to be critical of it, sometimes it doesn't come across that way, which is odd. But more than criticizing the specifics of the Brave New World, it is criticizing this very idea of constructing a utopia, of this utopian thinking being instrumentalized. I mean, obviously you can dream up whatever freaking world you like and have a lot of fun, and it can have a lot of meaning for people, and it can help shape the ways they act. But as an actual tool, or as an actual, I guess, if you are given, or if you have this ultimate power to actually put it into practice as an individual, or with an individualized sort of philosophy, then it won't work. That it is this sort of intermixing of different ideologies and philosophies that is required to make an actual functioning community or functioning world or system. That you need that sort of interplay between different people, different worldviews, or else you're going to end up with a very lopsided sort of world that is kind of scary and strange. So that's Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I didn't get particularly deep into the novel, but I mainly wanted to present a slightly different interpretation of it that I don't really see being talked about elsewhere. So that's sort of the idea in this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Spotify or Apple or any of these sort of places. Leave a review or 5 stars or something like that. It helps people find out about the show. Or you can subscribe on YouTube, where the channel is called Balckwell. You can visit my website, balckwell.substack.com, or I now have a custom domain, balckwell.online. So if you go to balckwell.online, there's my website. There I post nonfiction essays every 2 weeks that you can read and enjoy, and you can subscribe there to receive emails every time I do so. Final note, I recently published my own novel, Only in Dreams. Put that out last month. Sort of a love story, coming of age sort of tale. You may enjoy it if you enjoy these other things that I do, so check that out. It's on Amazon. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.